This is the Making Waves podcast. My name is Dave Rhoden, and we're here with Austin Goss. Austin is a reporter for the Dakota Scout. Welcome, Austin.
Hey, thanks for having me on, dude.
You are sort of the main reporter for the Dakota Scout because you live in Fort Pierre. You're not the only reporter, correct?
Yeah, no, that's correct. During session, that is especially. I'm up here every week, but that being said, my colleagues, Jonathan Ellis and Joe Snevy, rotate out every other week, essentially, and they're vital in our legislative coverage. Obviously, whenever the one isn't here, the other one who's back in Sioux Falls that week, because they both live in the Sioux Falls area, is constantly kind of keeping their ear to the ground, working on stories. We published a big story this week, Joe and I. And Joe did a lot of the reporting, really covered a lot of ground from Sioux Falls on this one-stop contracts that the state signed with a Rapid City developer. So, I'm here the whole time. So I guess by, way of the fact that I am the one in the building every day, I sort of probably do, I would guess on average, the bulk of it, but that's not to say that Jonathan and Joe don't do plenty. They both work very hard. We all work very hard during session, and I think we're proud of our small numbers but mighty output.
I'd agree with that. Everybody seems to really enjoy the Dakota Scout, and it's a very professional newspaper, and they appreciate their reporting. Getting back to you, could you give us a little bit of background about who you are, what's your qualifications, what about you?
Yeah, so in terms of reporting, I got a political science degree from Indiana several years ago. I'm getting kind of old. It's funny. I was at the University of Texas before I transferred to Indiana. I was working at a kind of conservative, right-leaning-ish publication that covered the legislature there. So the publication was, slightly right of center, but it wasn't anything crazy. I kind of picked up an appreciation of journalism when I was down there, and I was still working on what was, I think the University of Texas called a government degree, but it was essentially a political science degree, and got to cover the Texas legislature a little bit down there and sort of get my legs under me. And then when I was in Indiana, I finished my degree and figured I wanted to do journalism if nothing else worked out. And, of course, I was graduating right around when COVID was happening, and so it was just a very natural transition to, one of the few industries that was still hiring at the time. And, came out to Pierre area and just really hit the ground running. I always, when I do stuff, I really try to do them to 110%, and I feel like with journalism in South Dakota, that's something I like to think I have done. I just right away, as soon as I got here, really tried to start connecting with people and building connections and working sources and understanding the landscape. And same thing for that first legislative session, just trying to get the groundwork of how things worked and what a smoke out is and yada, 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 who the players were, what to watch for the next several years, and, who could lose a primary election and things like that. And, I've really obsessed myself over these things and tried to become stronger at them over years. But that's the professional side, and it's been quite a journey. It's funny to think I've been here several years now. I can still remember when I first got here being real. They had a special session to allocate COVID money. I remember then speaking of how Steve Haugard was pushing for that. I remember going into that special session, and it was like August, I think, and I kept telling myself, I don't know a single person in this building. I felt so out of place. It felt kind of wacky, and, now I'm in the Capitol. It's hard to find people I don't know. And certainly they're out there, but they're not as frequent as before. So I've really just tried to put the work in on that front.
But you've set down roots in South Dakota, and you're still going to school here, right?
Yeah, that's correct. I'm actually finishing up my MBA at the University of South Dakota. I'm on the local fire department here in Fort Pierre. Me and my family live in Fort Pierre, own a couple houses in the area, rentals, and our own. I'm in the South Dakota National Guard, have been for, several years. So we really set down roots here in central South Dakota and made it our home and love living here.
So there are a lot of subjects going through the South Dakota legislature this year. What's one of the biggest topics that they're talking about right now?
Well, obviously you kind of have, and, you've had people talk about on this podcast before, the prison and the pipeline and so forth and so forth, and those are all very big issues. But one that's kind of flown under the radar that will really kind of define the second half of session is some of these employee corruption and oversight measures that need to be taken. There's a couple of bills floating around right now, Senate Bill 60, HJR 5007, which is actually a resolution that are intended to sort of change the way that we do oversight in state government, and that's really largely in response to a couple of white-collar crime incidences that we had within the last year. I think we had 7 or 8 state employees who got busted doing some kind of financial crimes or otherwise attempting to cover them up. Some smaller than others really big. Some people might recall that we had the DSS employee who stole $1.2 million. And there's a real response from lawmakers now to try and wrap their hands around this and say, okay, what we're doing is not working. Where the Bureau of Finance and Management has all of this oversight, basically, is not working. What do we need to do to change it? So those two, that resolution and that bill that I mentioned, are sort of that first jab at maybe trying to shift some of that authority away from a BFM over the auditor. And it is astounding. I mean, it's the sort of one issue, Going back to last year, I think myself and my outlet, we've done a lot of the sort of groundbreaking, breaking news reporting on these scandals. The Department of Revenue unraveled before everyone's eyes. I think they had 4 or 5 employees charged from there, if I'm not mistaken. Total failure of oversight. Total mess. And we broke a lot of that. We're able to kind of get some of that reporting out in the air. Same thing on the DSS scandal, and we followed it all very closely and some of the reforms that Attorney General Jackley is trying to undertake. And we are here now, and it seems like the legislature might actually have a real chance to do something extremely transformative. Probably one of the most transformative things they could do this year. I would truly say up there with the pipeline and the prison in terms of what it could actually mean for the scope and future of the state if they do it the right way.
Could you tell us a little drill down here? So one of them is SB 60, and then, right, of course, is from the Senate. That would become law. And then the other one is HJR 5007, and that is a House joint resolution, which would put something on the ballot. Could you tell us the differences between those two?
Right. So a bill is, really it's just like a very, it's just like the Schoolhouse Rock segment where it's, I'm just a bill. So you just have to pass it. And then the real big difference is, the 2 chambers pass them, and it goes to the governor, and the governor can either sign or veto it. A resolution is really, because the key difference in this instance would be that a resolution does not go to the governor. Instead, it gets placed on the ballot. And it's not uncommon. I think every legislature has 1 or 2 ballot initiatives that they kind of want to place. I think there's kind of 3 circulating right now in the legislature that sort of have life. You'll recall in 2024, I think we had 1 legislative ballot measure that actually made it onto the ballot. I don't count RL21 because that was a referendum. That's the key difference. It's the resolution just requires legislative approval to get on the ballot, whereas a bill goes to the governor, and the governor can veto it.
Could you give us a little idea of what these bills do? Senate Bill 60 and the House Joint Resolution. What do they do exactly?
So Senate Bill 60 was Attorney General Jackley's bill that essentially allowed, and it's kind of crazy to think that the auditor currently doesn't have this sort of authority, and but it would allow the auditor to investigate and get into state agencies' sort of internal accounting systems. And when it was first testified in the Senate State Affairs Committee, there was sort of shock, I think, on behalf of the committee, who voted it out 9-0 originally in its original form, and I'll get to that. But there was sort of shock when both Auditor Rich Dackas and Attorney General Jackley said that some of these state agencies were actively fighting the auditor's office on releasing certain things or, making available certain documents. So this really all this bill said was, you have to let them do that. And it was interesting because the Bureau of Finance and Management, which is essentially like the governor's quote-unquote oversight agency that, has historically handled oversight of the accounting system and other entities. And again, you would look back to the last several government scandals we've had and sort of reflect on maybe the job that they've done. They testified against that bill. So it gets out of that committee 9-0 despite opposition from BFM. Gets to the Senate floor, and there's, for some reason, a pullback on it, and they wanted to put an amendment. So now it's slightly watered down from that version. It's kind of wonky on the specifics, but it's really I think you have to give a heads up on when you're actually going to do an investigation, or if you have to provide a more specific scope. It's a little more narrow, one might say, than it was originally, where you could really just kind of go in and make requests. I think is fair. However, the auditor gets a full-time employee out of the amended version, and that was sort of the compromise with BFM is, hey, we won't oppose this. In fact, we'll support it if you sort of rein in the investigative stuff, then we'll give you a full-time employee. But that did get through the Senate. I think it was unanimous. After the amendment, it was kind of a mess. On the other hand, HJR 5007 is Representative Goss's resolution, and that is the swing for the fences. It is the whole enchilada. It moves the entire state accounting system over to the auditor's office. It gives them full investigative authority, if I'm not mistaken. It's a real revolutionary piece of legislation that would really completely redefine, how some of our constitutional offices work. And then to boot, it also renames the Bureau of Finance and Management, something completely different, which is kind of just icing on the cake.
Transparency is for government and privacy is for individuals. These state agencies should be complying, and they should be transparent in what they're doing.
Yeah, I know this is a big ask, and it's not always fun to go listen to testimony from peer, but I would truly encourage anybody who wants to look into kind of sort of the way that sometimes lobbying organizations, private lobbying organizations, and big government work together on priorities, to go listen to the Senate State Affairs Committee hearing on Senate Bill 60. It was, it was truly like one of the most interesting, kind of best cut-through dichotomies of peer I think that you could ever get. You don't even have to have a total mastery of the issue to understand through listening to that sort of what the issue is. I would just strongly encourage it. And Marty Jackley too gave probably one of the best not just rebuttal, but maybe one of the best testimonies that I've ever heard anybody give in a legislative committee. It was poignant and absolutely really, really worth interesting too.
I did listen to it myself, and you're right about Marty Jackley's testimony. It was very compelling, and I'll put a link in it. We're going to move on here to the next little subject, pipeline. What's happening with that?
Yeah, it's interesting. That thing sails through the House, 1052, that's Carla Lem's bill, and that would really just say no eminent domain for carbon pipeline companies, which I think we all know who that would specifically deal with. So that flies through the House. I think it was 50 to 20, or someone was absent. It might have been 49 to 20, something right in there. But, you have a lot of these people who voted for 201 the prior year. Of course, I think everybody, especially who listens to this podcast, is very familiar with 201 now. You have quite a few of these people who previously supported 201 flip on this issue. I think they can read the tea leaves. And it sort of stalled out in the Senate. It seems like overall the philosophy Senate leadership this year has been kind of to work through Senate bills prior to getting to House bills, especially before crossover day when all of the legislation has to switch chambers before it dies. So it's kind of been sitting in limbo for a couple weeks. I know there's been a lot of kind of activists, members of House leadership who are kind of wondering when that's going to maybe make the jump into probably the Senate State Affairs Committee. I would think it has to be soon. It's been sitting there for quite a while, and again, it seems like the Senate leadership team really wants to kind of roll through Senate bills before they get to House bills, and there's certainly an argument for that, but it's going to be much closer in the Senate. I think, the Senate majority leaders said that he's opposed to the legislation, maybe would consider eminent domain reform of some sort. That chamber in leadership elections last year, which really, would look very similar to the sort of breakdown in the pipeline. The leadership elections was kind of determined by one vote in essentially all cases. So that pipeline vote is going to be intensely close. I wouldn't be surprised if 1052, again, that's Carla Lem's bill to limit eminent domain for carbon pipelines. I would think there's a decent chance maybe it gets amended and watered down over there. I don't know that with authority, but I would think that there's probably a better than decent chance of that now.
That bill is very much a litmus test. It's like one sentence, something like that, and it's very easy to read.
No, yeah, it's you take the time to read that bill, it's much easier to read than it is Senate Bill 60 or House Resolution 5007. That takes a little more time and analytical skills.
Mm-hmm. Other controversies, other bills that we're looking at are the funding for the prison, the appropriations for the men's prison in Lincoln County. What have you heard on that?
Yeah, it's funny. I believe it was yesterday, the GOP leadership during their press conferences, this was on Thursday, said that they were planning to move that into House State Affairs probably this coming week at some point. It sounded like was the plan. Of course, that will be one where I expect we will see a lot of people come to appear to listen to that. It's really quite interesting how much that's grown, and it's understandable. It's kind of funny when you compare it to they're building a women's prison right in the middle of downtown Rapid City, and that one's not hardly generated any buzz out there. You would think that might have elicited some of the same concerns that groups like NOPE have in Lincoln County, and understandably so, but it hasn't. But, yeah, that's probably going to come up next week, and I just keep thinking, Governor Rhoden keeps saying that this is a priority, we're absolutely going to get this through, we must get this through, there is no compromise. I don't know where the 2/3 is coming from. On an appropriations bill like that, you have to get it to 2/3 to pass it, and you look at the House especially, I think the Senate too, but in the House, I just don't see 2/3. It seems like an impossibility to me. I really think the governor's office would have to come up from the second floor to the third floor where the legislature is. That sort of metaphorically break some arms to get it across the line. I just don't see it. And I've been wrong before. I try not to be too often, but I'd be really, really surprised if that funding bill gets across the line. And then, of course, the question is, what do you do? The bill that I thought was kind of interesting, and I haven't read it well, but I thought it was maybe sort of an interesting one to keep an eye on is Senator Kevin Jensen, formerly representative, has a bill that would create like a prison task force, I think he calls it, and be kind of curated by the legislature and the executive branch, and the goal would be to sort of pick a new location or consider locations for a future prison. And, of course, the response of the administration would look something like, well, we have tens of millions of dollars in this site. And you might recall a couple of weeks ago, the Dakota Scout, we wrote about how they were starting to clear land without a permit there at the proposed prison site. But, yeah, that one could be kind of interesting to watch, too, that Kevin Jensen bill, especially if the actual funding package goes down itself. Again, I would expect that comes up maybe next week.
And other issues that have been coming up that are very popular or have a lot of popular support is dealing with property taxes. Property taxes obviously have shot up in South Dakota. Everybody's complaining about them. And I've heard multiple people say that when they go door to door in the primaries and the general election, perhaps, but most of the time that the big issue that voters have is property taxes and how expensive it's getting. There's several bills that are in the legislature right now. Could you tell us a little bit about those?
To your point, I was talking to a lawmaker, Representative Trish Ladner, actually, who's been kind of one of the louder members of the legislature on this issue for a long time, for as long as I can remember being there. That is lowering property taxes. And she, I believe, said to me at some point late last year, or something like that, if we don't figure this out, it's going to be what, sort of the pipeline has become, what 201 was last year, where there is just a groundswell of voters who respond in kind to the lack of or, sort of perceived failure of the state capitol to get this this issue answered, excuse me. But, so, and I think that's right. I think people, that people vote with their wallets more than they do anything else. And when you go to pay your property tax bill twice a year and it's gone up by, more than 10%, it's hard to look at that and think, this is acceptable to me. There's always kind of interesting, and Governor Rhoden had a good point the other day talking about this issue. He's assembled a task force to look into the matter and so forth, but he said, he's not a huge fan of tax shifts. And, sometimes when you look at these property tax cut bills, these bills dealing with property taxes, that's sort of what it ends up being. I can't remember who it was, and this has come up before, but I've seen one recently that was having to do with the elderly. And certainly you sympathize with the elderly. I mean, nobody should get priced out of their homes like that. It's sort of antithetical to, the American dream. But, then the question becomes, well, what about young people who can't buy a house, right? I mean, and then vice versa. I mean, if you did a carve-out for young people, you would say, okay, well, what about old people who are getting priced out of their house? I've found interesting, I believe Senator Sue Peterson has a bill that would just freeze rates for 2 years, 3 years. I think something like that might be more possible this year, just to kind of, put a Band-Aid on a bullet wound for now. And I believe Representative Odenbach said something the other day to that effect, that maybe this year they look for something to kind of ease the problem, work on it, come up with a very broad proposal in the next year. And he had an interesting point too. He said that it's hard to have this conversation without talking about school funding, because school funding is where property taxes by and large go. And so without talking about one, you can't really talk about the other. And most people are, and I think that's basically correct. I think until you figure out a new way, or otherwise figure out a way to cut school funding, which most people would say would be extremely difficult, I don't know that you can have a full, robust conversation about cutting property taxes in a long-term, meaningful way. I think I do think that Governor Rhoden, this is certainly something he's worked on for a long time. When you listen to him talk about it, you can tell he cares about it. There seems to be a realization in both chambers that, like I said before, that if they don't start to move on this topic, it could come back to bite them in the butt politically. So I do think we'll see something get done this year, the size of which I'm not sure yet.
That's good to hear. What can you tell us a little bit? You're not in the trenches like the other legislators are. What can you tell us a little bit about the transition from governors to Governor Rhoden?
It's so interesting, because Governor Rhoden was such a force of personality, so much of what she was, like the very essence of her rotated around her as she was sort of preceded herself. It was constant just slog sort of covering her, and I think she liked it that way, to sort of constantly be kind of chasing headlines, in the national news and in the national scene, and obviously it paid off for her. She got a high-ranking position in the Trump administration. But it's been very interesting to sort of see the difference in the way that the two governors administrate. Certainly both strengths, probably both weaknesses that have yet to be seen. But to say in the first couple of weeks, I think that Rhoden has done probably 7 or 8 interviews, brought back weekly legislative press conferences that Governor Noem had given up about 2 or 3 years ago. So he seems to really be committed to openness. I will maybe a little less pop in terms of sort of stories you're getting out of them. Kristi Noem sure knew how to get herself a headline, and that sometimes is good, and that sometimes is probably bad, and she would probably agree with that analysis. But Larry Rhoden is a little more steady Eddie, seems to be really just thinking about, I think, what comes next for him, whether that's another term in the governor's office or not. But there's not going to be another political office after this for him, I don't think. I think he will, as he put it a couple of weeks ago, ride off into the sunset back to Union Center. It's just a totally different frame of mind, and you can feel that sort of percolate through everything that he is doing, just like you could with Noem. I mean, I was talking to someone today. She gave an address on the border back last legislative session, how it was affecting South Dakota, and there's certainly a lot of evidence of that, and there was a lot of evidence of that at the time. But it's sort of funny to look back on now that she used the legislative session to deliver this very rah-rah political speech, and it worked. I mean, she is now the DHS secretary.
Any final thoughts you have?
I would urge, I always say, important to, I was talking to the T Area Titan Middle School a couple of weeks ago. They came up for a field trip to the state capitol, and I urge them all to get involved. In their cases, to be pages and to, the people that help out in the legislative session, high school students. That's probably not something that would be available to the people listening to this podcast, or an opportunity that wouldn't. But, I will say, and I say it all the time, that so many people get wrapped up into Washington politics and the things that happen in Washington and how it impacts our lives. And it's certainly important, and it certainly does, and it's worth watching. But I tell people all the time that what happens in Pierre every day impacts our lives. Just in this 25 minutes we've been talking, we talked about the carbon pipeline. That's something that affects thousands of people. The prison, that's something that will affect thousands of people more when you think about inmates and employees and people going to visit families, et cetera. I mean, it's just, you could rattle them all off. I mean, there's another bill that would legalize sports gambling and put that money towards school funding so that we could lower property taxes. I mean, think about it. That literally affects everyone. And there's probably going to be a real serious conversation about that. I mean, every bill in Pierre affects someone, more or less. And so with a new governor and a new process starting, he's still very new at this point, Governor Rhoden, there's really not a better time to get involved, think about different organizations, start to pay a little bit of attention, and talk to people about the whole process, because it does matter. What happens in Pierre matters, and it's often overlooked. And I think it's become less overlooked, thankfully, over the last several years, thanks to new mediums like yours and others that have sort of picked up the mantle to bring unfiltered news and updates to people on different platforms and in different ways. But I think it's always a good time to get involved, and especially ahead of what will be a very busy 2026 election cycle.
I completely agree. The price of liberty is eternal vigilance. Thank you very much for being with us. This has been the Making Waves podcast. My name is Dave Rotman, and we've been with Austin Goss, our reporter for the Dakota Scout.